This week, we received a reminder from Palestinian Authority leader Mahmoud Abbas that the Americans' long-term strategy for managing Gaza is completely insane. I'll have details and where all of this is likely to go in Israeli society and beyond coming up on In Focus. On August 15th, Palestinian Authority leader Mahmoud Abbas gave a speech before the Turkish parliament. And before I go into what he said, let's just remind ourselves a couple of things. Starting at the really opening days of the war, one of the key criticisms that the Biden administration kept making against the Israeli government generally and Prime Minister Netanyahu specifically is that Israel was not providing a plan for the day after in Gaza. And these criticisms of Netanyahu by the Biden administration became more and more extreme with each passing week and month since October 7th. Prime Minister Netanyahu hasn't presented us with a plan for the day after Gaza. And Prime Minister Netanyahu kept saying over and over again that the day after Gaza starts after Hamas has been destroyed and the hostages have been returned. And until that, we're still on this day. That is, you can't plan a post-war strategy when the war hasn't been won yet. First, we have to win, and then we can talk about it. In his speech before the joint houses of Congress last month, Prime Minister Netanyahu set forth this idea of a multinational force with Israel retaining overall security control over the Gaza Strip that would form some sort of a consortium that would bring in moderate Gazans that weren't involved with Hamas local leaders. Another aspect that Israel has tried to do, but most of the people who were involved with it were murdered by Hamas shortly thereafter. At any rate, the whole point is that you can't get an alternative leadership to emerge so long as Hamas remains in charge of Gaza. And Hamas, thanks to America's insistence on humanitarian aid being brought into Gaza, Hamas has had no real competition for its continued regime in Gaza's continued control over the political system in Gaza and all of the organs of governance in Gaza are still controlled by Hamas because the United States has prevented its collapse through its humanitarian aid program. Once there's no shortage of food, there's no shortage of water, there's no shortage of medicines, Hamas remains in charge of dispersing it all to the public. Then nobody can cross Hamas because they're in charge of the aid. And we've shown this over and over and over again over the months of war that this is what has happened as a result of the Americans' insistence that Israel allow the delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza. Anyway, I digress. The point is that the United States kept saying over and over again, Israel has to give a plan for the day after. And the purpose of this pressure was very clear, that the Americans said from the outset that they want to have some sort of a reformed Palestinian Authority that's controlled by Fatah, that's going to take over Gaza after the day after the war. And, from the outset, the Israeli government, Prime Minister Netanyahu, the Knesset have all made clear that the Palestinian Authority is not a moderate force and that if they take over, it just means that Hamas will remain in charge because not only is the Palestinian Authority, particularly in Gaza, not as powerful as Hamas even at the end of the war, but also it shares Hamas's vision for the annihilation of the Jews of Israel, the annihilation of the Jewish state, and participates in terrorism against Israel to that end. In fact, Fatah forces, as we've shown throughout the war, have repeatedly stated proudly that their own forces participated in the October 7th invasion and slaughter and kidnapping of Israelis from Gaza, which is true. And we'll show you more again. We'll just remind you of that footage now. But all of this is just this overwhelming pile of evidence that the Palestinian Authority is not a moderate alternative to Hamas. Like Hamas, it is completely committed to the annihilation of Israel. And the United States just won't listen. And they keep saying that it's moderate. And why is this? Because the Americans give the Palestinian Authority over $500 million in direct funding every year. They're funding the Palestinian Authority security forces, which we'll get to in a second. They're training them. They have Lieutenant General Mike Fenton, who operates from the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem, who is responsible for training the Palestinian security forces and for arming them and for funding them. So, the United States is completely invested in the idea that the Palestinian Authority and its security forces are not terrorist forces, that they are moderate, that they are U.S. equities that can be turned to as moderates to make peace with Israel or some such thing and take control over not only Gaza, but in the vision of the Biden-Harris administration, take over Judea and Samaria as well, in some ultimate final peace deal that's going to form the Palestinian state that in just about every public statement, Kamala Harris has to say how much she supports, et cetera, et cetera. So here comes Mahmoud Abbas. He speaks at the Turkish parliament on August 15th. And now just here, too, we have to remember what is Turkey's role in this war. So Turkey under Recep Erdogan is a sponsor, not an enemy of Hamas. To the contrary, NATO member Turkey has served as an operational base for Hamas. They've, carried out attacks against Israel that have been directed by Hamas terrorists in Turkey for over a decade. So Turkey is a major logistical base for Hamas. It's a major operational base. It's a major headquarters for Hamas. It's a fundraising base. The Turks pay a lot of money to Hamas in zakat, in the Islamic charitable donations, etc. So Turkey is Hamas. Recep Erdogan, who considers himself to be the head of the Muslim Brotherhood in the world, he views Hamas, which is a Muslim Brotherhood organization, as his sister group, and he supports them. So here is Mahmoud Abbas, the head of Fatah, the head of the Palestinian Authority, coming into Hamas's, home field and speaking to a parliament that is completely on board with Hamas, because as we know, Turkey goes to elections, but it elects the same people over and over again, whether on purpose or not. It really doesn't matter. At any rate, the Turkish parliament is controlled by Islamists who support Hamas, who view themselves as Muslim brothers, and Turkey and their leader, Recep Erdogan, as the head of the Muslim Brotherhood. And he goes there and he tells them, not anything different, by the way, than he says in Ramallah. And so he came there and he eulogized Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh as a martyr. And let's just watch a clip of what he said about Ismail Haniyeh.
واسمحوا لي أيتها الأخوات أيها الإخوة أن أبدأ حديثي إليكم بالترحم على أرواح عشرات آلاف الشهداء الذين ارتقوا لباريهم بسبب العدوان الإسرائيلي وحرب الإبادة والتطهير العرقي التي يشنها على شعبنا في غزة والضفة الغربية والقدس الشريف والتي كان آخرها الجريمة بحق الشهيد القائد إسماعيل هنية وأدعوكم إخوتي وأخواتي لقراءة الفاتحة على روحه وأرواح شهداء فلسطين الأبرار.
So, okay, this guy again. The United States paints the Palestinian Authority as a competitor, as the alternative to Hamas, as the moderate alternative to Hamas. And here's Mahmoud Abbas eulogizing brother Ismail Haniyeh, right, the martyr, and calling for more people, to be like him, and he is a model, right? There's no daylight between Fatah and Hamas as far as Abbas is concerned, and this is very important, right? Because if there's to be a day after with the Palestinian Authority, the only way that can lead to any sort of peace and security in the region is if the Palestinian Authority is opposed to Hamas. And the exact opposite is the case, as Mahmoud Abbas just made clear at the Turkish parliament on August 15th. But that's not all. So the United States, again, U.S. taxpayers are funding, and it's really closer to $1 billion with U.S. aid to Palestinian NGOs that are aligned with Fatah, that are aligned, by the way, with Hamas in Gaza, in Judea and Samaria. The United States, though, officially about $500,000 paid to the Palestinian Authority. They're invested in this entity. And now see what Mahmoud Abbas says about the United States of America at the end of his remarks. And by the way, see how these remarks about the United States of America, about the most important state sponsor of the Palestinian Authority in the world, the United States of America, the Biden administration, see how he describes them.
3 مرات في مجلس الأمن ضد مطالبة العالم بوقف العدوان الإسرائيلي في قطاع غزة. 3 مرات تقف المندوبة الأمريكية في مجلس الأمن وتستعمل فيتو لحالها، و14 آخرون يطالبون بوقف القتال. هذه هي أمريكا، هي الطاعون والطاعون أمريكا.
You got that? America is the plague of the Middle East. The United States of America is the plague of the Middle East. The United States, arguably also the European Union, but certainly first and foremost, the United States under the Biden administration, which renewed U.S. funding to the Palestinian Authority, arguably illegally, because the Palestinian Authority pays, I think, 7% of its annual budget in payments to Palestinian terrorists who are incarcerated in Israeli prisons for carrying out terrorist operations against Israelis, and in annuities to the families of Palestinian terrorists who were killed in the course of or in the aftermath of carrying out terrorist operations against Israel. So 7% of the U.S.-funded Palestinian Authority's budget every year goes to payments to terrorists, which obviously incentivizes terrorism. And these people have a sliding scale of payments. I think a lot of you are aware of it. It's called pay for slay. The more Israelis you kill, the higher your payments. And at any rate, the average payment to a jailed Palestinian terrorist from the Palestinian Authority is larger than the annual average salary of Palestinian Authority residents. So you can make more money than the average Palestinian if you are a terrorist and commit crimes against Israel, because you're incentivized, you're paid for your crimes by the Palestinian Authority. Very important. So anyway, the United States passed a law in 2017 called the Taylor Force Act, named after Taylor Force, former U.S., I think, Marine. No, he was a Ranger, at any rate, who served in Iraq, and he was studying in the United States, and he went on a program with his class to Tel Aviv, and he was murdered by a Fatah terrorist in Tel Aviv. So the United States reacted to Taylor Force's murder by passing in 2017 or 2018 the Taylor Force Act that said that the United States could not fund the Palestinian Authority so long as they maintained their pay-for-slay program. But despite Taylor Force, the Biden administration reinstated the payments that the Trump administration, in adherence to the Taylor Force Act, President Trump signed into law after it was overwhelmingly passed by both houses of Congress. President Biden sort of he stopped the enforcement of Taylor Force and reinstated U.S. funding to the Palestinian Authority immediately after assuming office in 2021. Okay, and in return, Mahmoud Abbas returns the favor, returns the massive support that the United States gives to the Palestinian Authority monetarily and also through military training of its security forces by calling the United States the plague of the Middle East. Okay? That should be a big deal, right? That should mean something. Here's a man who's essentially an American proxy. He exists because of the United States. And it's not just that the United States is supporting Abbas, presenting him as an alternative, him, his people as alternatives. It's not just that. It's also that they're pressuring Israel to enable these people to take over Gaza as if this is some sort of long-term plan that will allow Israel to withdraw our forces from Gaza and bring the residents of the communities that were invaded and massacred on October 7th back into their communities, rebuild their communities, return them to their homes. Okay. And obviously, this is not true because it's not just that he hates the United States and that he supports Hamas, as he made clear in this speech. And also in the speech, he said, we're committed to Sharia law, meaning we're going to be an Islamic state that is governed by Sharia, in which non-Muslims are either killed or treated as second-class citizens. And he himself has a long history, Mahmoud Abbas does, of saying that no Jew is going to be allowed ever to live in Palestine. They have death penalty on a law that they passed that says that any Palestinian found to be selling land to Jews has to be immediately killed, not Israelis, but Jews. So, he says no Jews will be allowed to live in Palestine, and he implements this law that calls for the execution, either official or extrajudicial, of any Palestinian who is found selling land to Jews or collaborating with Israel in any way. So that's the peacemaker, that's the moderate Palestinian leader. But it's not just that, it's also that the security services that the United States trains and funds and arms are engaged in terrorism. And I talked about this in March, so a ways back, when the nonprofit organization, the Israeli nonprofit organization Regavim, which follows both land theft by Palestinians and Arab Israelis of state lands, and also terrorism being carried out by the Palestinian Authority security services. So they published a report called Officers by Day, Terrorists by Night in March, where they documented cases where the Palestinian Authority's security forces themselves, again, that are paid and trained and armed by the United States, claimed responsibility for terrorism and bragged about the role that PA security forces, PASF forces, played in carrying out actual terrorist attacks. And so this is all just based on the Palestinian Authority security forces' own reports, their own publications, their own websites, where they claim responsibility, where they say, this guy, our lieutenant colonel, lieutenant, sergeant, whatever it is, in the Palestinian Authority security services is a martyr. He carried out this terrorist attack against Israel. So just based on the Palestinian Authority's own data, their own publications, not on any official Israeli numbers, only on what the Palestinian Authority said themselves, and they did this by calling years of Palestinian Authority security forces web pages, and they found that 78 instances between 2020 and 2024 where the Palestinian Authority security forces claimed responsibility, or said that 78 members of the Palestinian security forces were terrorists who had committed terrorist attacks. Many of them were killed. Many of them were not killed. But 78, by their own accounting that Regavim could locate, were identified by the Palestinian Authority security forces as terrorists who worked for them. Okay? And it's not just that. The Regavim report goes into statements that are made by Palestinian Authority security forces spokespeople about the participation of Palestinian Authority security forces in terrorist attacks. So, for instance, the official spokesman for the PA security system, his name is Colonel Talal Dwaycott. He gave a lot of interviews since October 7th, and he responded, for instance, I'm just going to read this to you, responding to criticism in Al Jazeera that, quote, the PA makes no contribution to the struggle against the Zionist entity and even cooperates with it, mostly on security cooperation, Dwaycott responded, we have no objective other than achieving liberation, independence, and the establishment of a state. So that is, we have no objective other than the destruction of Israel. Dwaycott expressed great pride, speaking for the Fatah movement and also for the Palestinian Authority security forces, that for 30 years, the PASF, 30 years of the Palestinian Authority's existence. So since Israel embarked on the Oslo peace process and established the Palestinian Authority security forces for the first time in May 1994, so 30 years. He said over that 30-year period, The security forces have sacrificed more than 2,000 men in terrorist attacks against Israel. More than 2,000 martyrs, he said, hundreds of prisoners, among them those serving life sentences. He's bragging about this. So 2,000 Palestinian Authority security forces, paid for by the United States really since the outset of the Palestinian Authority, and they've been trained and funded and armed by the U.S. since the Bush administration, with an interruption during the Trump years when Trump stopped it with the passage of Taylor Force. So the United States has been funding, arming, and training the Palestinian Authority security forces for the better part of the past 30 years. And here is their official spokesman, Talal Dwayka, a colonel in the Palestinian security forces, saying that over that same period, 2,000 members of these U.S.-supported, sponsored security forces have been martyred, killing Israelis in the act of committing terrorism against Israeli civilians and security forces. Hundreds are incarcerated. Many have been convicted of murder. Okay, and he also said that he and Palestinian Authority official, former security chief Jibril Rajoub, said that the Palestinian Authority security forces make up 12% of all Palestinian terrorists incarcerated in Israel. So this is supposed to be the security force that Israel is supposed to be able to work with, that's supposed to, in the American vision of the day after, take over security responsibility in Gaza in some sort of reformed Palestinian Authority. Here is the head of the Palestinian Authority speaking before the Turkish parliament, calling the United States the plague of the Middle East, and eulogizing Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh, and praising Hamas, saying that the Palestinian Authority shares Hamas's vision of a Sharia state, okay, of an Islamic republic, essentially, of Palestine, if you will. And yet he's the Americans' guy for the day after in Gaza, and obviously also for the day after in Judea and Samaria, when there's going to be a Palestinian state. So when we listen to him and we take a step back, right, the Americans are now placing huge pressure on Israel to accept a ceasefire deal with Hamas that would effectively, as it's being described anyway in the media, be a complete defeat, a strategic defeat for Israel and a strategic victory for Hamas, because it would survive. And we've talked about this also since October 7th, that for Hamas, winning means surviving. It means that Yahya Sinwar is still alive. It means that Hamas still is the political force to be reckoned with in Gaza, that no alternative force can raise its head without having its head chopped off, literally, right? And be able to reconstitute its military forces by Israel being removed from the international border in Rafah with Egypt. And incidentally, there over the past couple of days, we found out that there, are thousands of tunnels and tunnel entrances, dozens of tunnels that traverse the border between Gaza and Egypt. So, this is obviously a strategic highway for the transit of terrorists and terror material, both to build things inside of Gaza and also simply to bring them in, as we saw on October 7th, so destructively. So we're seeing here an American plan that's also in the peace, that in the ceasefire deal that the United States is trying to shove down Israel's throat in Doha, that would leave Hamas intact. And then the day after plan would be to bring Mahmoud Abbas's Palestinian Authority security forces into Gaza, and so justify Israel walking away because these are moderates who can take it over. So now we see that the entire plan is not it. It's doable in the sense that they're willing to work together to kill Jews, but it's not a plan that an ally of Israel would support. It's not a plan that an administration that is determined to fight Islamic terrorism, that maintains, as Harris says, as Biden has said, as all of the senior officials in the administration say, an ironclad commitment to Israel's security. This is not an ironclad commitment to Israel's security. To the contrary, it's an ironclad commitment to the survival of jihadist terrorists who just committed the gravest atrocity against the Jewish people since the Holocaust, and the most sadistic act of orgiastic murder and rape and kidnapping and torture that we've ever seen in Israel. And really, it was more sadistic what they did on October 7th than what ISIS did to the Yazidis in Iraq, and we have to keep that in mind, and they put it all on their GoPro cameras and they posted it so that they have been reveling in it. And we have to remember that, because survival of Hamas means the survival of that, means the rewarding of that, means that Israel is supposed to accept that the people who did that to our children, to our sons and daughters, to our mothers and fathers, to our sisters and brothers in the communities along the Gaza border, that they get to survive to kill again, that they get to look at October 7th as their liberation day because they did it and survived to fight another day. And whether it's together with the Palestinian Authority, which has bragged that its own Fatah forces also involved themselves in the atrocities of October 7th, and whose security forces are actively engaged in terrorism to this day, or whether it's just Hamas in charge, it really doesn't matter. It leads to the same thing, which is a continuation of the terrorist war with Israel, but buoyed by the sense that you can commit a one-day Holocaust of such monstrous proportions that it's still largely unspeakable, and is, everybody wanting to maintain this fiction that you can reach a meeting of the minds or the hearts with the Palestinian leadership, whether Fatah or Hamas, is desperately trying to sweep under the rug or blame Israel for. This is an idea that is, aside from being crazy, it's also, frankly, evil, because you're telling the Jewish state, you have to empower people who just burned your babies alive. And no nation can reconcile with this. And by the way, we've talked about the ceasefire deal that they're putting on the table. It's one that would only free a small portion of the hostages. There are 115 hostages, more or less, in Gaza. They're talking about freeing 30 of them. That leaves 85 people behind in Gaza, including our sons, our young men. We'll get to that in the course of the week. But I think, we have to remember all of this plan of the day after, based on the Palestinian Authority coming in, based on Hamas surviving through this ceasefire for a couple of hostages deal that the Americans are pushing Israel to accept in Doha. All of this is a mortal threat to Israel. Because not only does it empower Hamas, it tells them, go ahead, keep taking hostages, keep slaughtering. This is what you win with. This is your winning hand. This is a good idea. So that's a really bad thing. And then, the other thing is that, it's one of, talking about the Palestinian Authority for me always seems like, haven't we been through this before? Haven't we discussed this enough already? Do I really have to talk about this again? The proof of the Palestinian Authority's involvement in and duplicity for and support of and financing of terrorism is so copious. It's so mountainous. We've gone over this, we've plowed this soil so many times. It's all known. Anybody who looks at it knows. Anybody willing to countenance reality knows. And I find it irksome and tiresome to even have to keep revisiting it over and over and over again. How are we still going through this reality where we still have to talk about how extreme, how genocidal the Palestinian Authority is, how dedicated it is to jihad and the annihilation of the Jewish people? How often do we have to do it? This has been going on for 30 years, as Dwight said, right? Why do we have to keep going on this merry-go-round? Why can't we get off? And then, you realize what lengths the supporters of this fiction of peace between Israel and the Palestinian authorities, what lengths they'll go through in order to block this obvious, overwhelming truth from ever getting the recognition required in order to actually direct U.S. policy, direct, God forbid, European policy, or finally finally empower Israel to just walk away from the Palestinian Authority and treat it as the enemy, which it has always been. And Michael Duran, my friend, has been on the show several times. He wrote a very important article in Tablet Magazine that I think came out the week before last, and the article was called "The Anti-Israel Sanctions Machine," and we talked about how, beginning in February, President Biden issued this executive order, which essentially gave the framework for the United States to go after Israelis. And here it is: Israel is invaded. We suffer the gravest atrocity we've ever suffered since the establishment of the State of Israel, since the end of the Holocaust. And the United States responds 4 months later by beginning a systematic policy of sanctioning Israelis, right? Because obviously, if you have an ironclad commitment to Israel's security, that's, the obvious move. Let's start sanctioning the Israelis whose security is sacrosanct for your administration. At any rate, so Mike Duran wrote this article called "The Anti-Israel Sanctions Machine." And he did something very important, which is that he started naming names. And he explained, who is behind it, who is involved in sanctioning Israelis. And he talked about Mike Fensel, the security coordinator in Judea and Samaria, who's played a central role in it. And he also talked about Kamala Harris's a former Middle East advisor who moved over to strategic planning in the Security Council, who's a leading member, an enthusiastic member, he said, of this group. And that's Ilan Goldenberg. So Ilan Goldenberg is also responsible for this. And he was just named last week by Kamala Harris to be her liaison to the Jewish community, which is ironic because, as I wrote, I think, or I spoke about, I can't remember, in one of my articles or shows last week, I guess maybe it was Twitter. Sorry. Anyway, Ilan Goldenberg is out of step with 90% of American Jews. 90% of American Jews support Israel. And there is Ilan Goldenberg saying he doesn't support Israel, that, he supports a condominium between Fatah and Hamas, that he thinks it's unrealistic to defeat Hamas in this war. And he is responsible, again, 4 months after October 7th, for the sanctioning of Israelis. So that's Ilan Goldenberg, which is very important. Anyway, so they, as Michael wrote, and you should read the article just because it's important, it shows the mechanics of how this is done. These people aren't charged with any crime. Most of them have never been investigated for any crime because they haven't committed any crimes under Israeli law or under American law. They're being sanctioned because they are, because either, in the case of some of them, they're easy to castigate. And Michael Duran gave an example of Elor Azaria, who killed a prostrate terrorist when he was serving in the army in Hebron because he claimed he saw the terrorist move and he was afraid that he had a suicide belt on him. This was after the terrorist had wounded one of Azaria's comrades in the army, and he was a medic and he came to help. And then he claimed he saw the terrorist move, and so he shot him. And then he was tried, and what many Israelis felt in 2018, I think, was a biased court. And he was tried for, I think, manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter, and he was sentenced to jail. He served jail time and got out. Now he's married. He opened up a bakery in Raleigh. Okay, so this was all a long time ago. And yet the administration just sanctioned him so that they blocked his bank account, they blocked his family's bank account, they said he's not allowed to go into the United States. He to the extent that he did commit a crime, he was found guilty of it and he served time and he paid his dues. And yet here is the United States. Why are they doing it? Because it's I don't know why. I guess to to try to tell Israelis, if you act like that, you're gonna have your bank account frozen. But they've gone after Israelis who've tried to block the so-called humanitarian aid, which has maintained Hamas in power in Gaza for the past 10 months. And so they went after a mother of 8 who's the head of this protest movement that she founded called Savtesha, Command 9, Order 9, which she said was essentially for people to come and block lorries of equipment and supplies from entering into Gaza under the false headline humanitarian aid, which is really just resupply to Hamas, and then any civilian that Hamas feels like giving it to. So that's others that they've gone after ranchers, Jewish ranchers. And the way that the sanctions machine works, and I talked about this when they started being implemented, even before they started being implemented in the wintertime, but then in March, that what they do is they have cooperative arrangements with these radical NGOs that operate in Judea and Samaria, including Peace Now and others who also have arms in the United States. And they complain against Israelis who are taking actions that either enable Israel to win the war, as in the case of those who oppose the humanitarian aid, the resupply of Hamas getting into Gaza, or they are ranchers and they protect state lands from Palestinian encroachment and therefore solidified Israel's control over the sort of open space in Judea and Samaria, which is antithetical to the American goal of forcing all of the Jews out or into little enclosures and then giving the vast majority of control over Judea and Samaria or all of Judea and Samaria to the Palestinian security forces. So these are the type of people who have been, sanctioned so far by the United States. And basically what they all have in common, more or less, except Elor Azarian, who knows where he stands politically, is that they oppose the American policy goal of establishing a Palestinian state and of Israel not defeating Hamas in this war and not taking apart Hamas's political regime in Gaza. So they have a policy difference with the United States. And as a result, the United States on a monthly basis, as Michael pointed out in his article, is posting these sanctions against new tranches, additional tranches of Israeli citizens that banned them from the banking system and banned them from them or any of their immediate family members from entering the United States, and also threatened to sanction anybody who tries to help them. So these are draconian acts against people who are innocent of any crime, whose only bad action is that they're advancing policies that the United States doesn't like because they're not aligned with America's policy goal of establishing a Palestinian state, which is viewed in Rhine and in control of Judea and Samaria and of Gaza. So what was notable this week is that, and this gets us, don't worry, to Mahmoud Abbas again, is that there was a story, and I apologize, I haven't followed it too much, but there was a violent incident in the village of Jit, which is in northern Samaria, not far from Kadumim and in the Israeli community of Kadumim. And so an Israeli motorist had apparently entered the village of Jit, and he was attacked with firecrackers and Molotov cocktails, and he called the security forces, and he called the army, and they came, and there was a big commotion. And one of the Palestinians who was attacking both the motorist and the people who came to his rescue, and the military forces who came to his rescue. So the IDF forces killed one of the rioters, one of the assailants, and he was immediately presented in the media as somebody who was innocent, and actually the aggressors were the Jews, and he was innocent. And so we've talked about him in the past. Elton Groner, who's the chief editor of the Jewish Voice Hakol Yehudi news service, he posted the actual identity of the Palestinian who was killed in the incident. And he has, he just went onto his Facebook page and he saw, this very long a history of posts glorifying Hamas murderers, having himself taken a picture with a submachine gun, et cetera, et cetera. And then Hamas, it works out after he was killed, put out a mourning notice, so claiming that he was a member of Hamas. So Elchanan Groner puts up this report saying, this was a Hamas terrorist who was killed. This is not an innocent boy or an innocent civilian, as the Israeli media and the world media are really quick to say. No, he was a terrorist. And so what was notable here was the response of Yariv Oppenheimer, who's the former head of Peace Now, and now he's the head of, I don't know, what other radical leftist organization. And he responded to Elchanan Groner's tweet by saying to him, I will personally ensure that you are sanctioned. My word. Okay. You have my word on it. That's what he wrote. And this is a stunning thing, right? So you have a journalist who is publishing on his Telegraph page, on his Twitter page, on the website of the Kol Yehudi, of the Jewish Voice news service in Hebrew. He's publishing this very relevant information. His name, the name of the terrorist who was killed, his name is Rashid Abed El-Qadar Sada, and he was killed by Israeli security forces while he was engaged in this attack against this Israeli motorist and then those who came to rescue him. And Yariv Oppenheimer says, I'm going to get the U.S. to sanction you. You have my word for it, for publishing this information. Now, he didn't say actually that this was untrue. He didn't say it was false. Later, he said that it was false and that, it's not true just because people put up posts or whatever. Not quite sure. Anyway, he tried to say that there's no proof that this guy is a Hamas terrorist, even though Hamas says he's a Hamas terrorist and he says he loves Hamas on his Facebook page. So, but that's not the point. The point isn't even whether the contention was true. I mean, you have fake news published in Israeli media every day. You have false news stories published abroad every day. And you just look at the New York Times on a daily basis. It's either not true or biased or whatever, and bent in one direction to such a degree that it's hard to even know what ended up happening. So this is the media, right? So say that Groner exaggerated. This guy was just a Hamas supporter and Hamas likes its supporters, so it put out a condolence call and he wasn't an actual terrorist. But the interesting thing wasn't even that. It was Yariv Oppenheimer's response. I'm going to get you sanctioned. You have my word for it. So the crime that Elchanan Groner would be sanctioned for is reporting news that is inconvenient, that is hard. It makes it more difficult to maintain the fiction, right? That Hamas isn't a big deal in Judea and Samaria, or that the Palestinian Authority isn't a terrorist organization, that Palestinian Authority security forces aren't terrorists. So, what these sanctions are now doing is working in, or they're geared towards deterring people, and it could include me as well in the future in a Harris administration, for instance, when there are no guardrails of an encroaching election coming up or whatever. It could be anybody. It's right now being there's a court case now in Texas of American Christians who are suing and claiming very reasonably that this executive order not only is illegal, but that it undermines the constitutional freedoms of American citizens who support Israeli organizations in Judea and Samaria, which is true. And so here is Yariv Oppenheimer using the fact of these sanctions to say to Elchanan Groner, if you keep publishing this information, or he didn't even say that, he just said, he didn't even say if, he said, I'm going to have you sanctioned, right? He said, I'm going to personally ensure that you get sanctioned. You have my word for it. Sanctioned alai. That's what he said. I'm going to personally ensure that you get sanctioned. Trust me, right? That's what he said. And this is amazing because that means that the United States sanctions policy is not only geared towards punishing people who the United States doesn't like because they're undermining the narrative that the Palestinian Authority is moderate, or that, you can give humanitarian assistance to Gaza that isn't going directly to Hamas, etc. But it's also serving, looking forward, as a deterrent to block any open discourse on the nature of reality of the Palestinian Authority, of Palestinian society, of the relationship between the Palestinian Authority security forces and Hamas, Islamic Jihad, etc. Mahmoud Abbas and Ismail Haniyeh, Yahya Sinwar, and so on and so forth, so that they're actually, as Yariv Oppenheimer says, being used for that nefarious purpose. So, going back to where I started with Mahmoud Abbas' case, he's gone to he's spoken, he's attacked Israel in anti-Semitic ways, using anti-Semitic imagery from the podium of the UN General Assembly. Okay, this, like he did it, I think, 2 years ago, where he said that we were desecrating the Temple Mount with our dirty feet, right? Dirty feet, because Jews go up to the Temple Mount and our feet are dirty, unclean, because we're vermin, right? We're unclean. We're not allowed to go up to Judaism's holiest site. He is an anti-Semite. He hates Jews. He has constantly, repeatedly used anti-Semitic language to describe Israelis, to describe Jews. And here he is praising Ismail Haniyeh, Hamas leader, and he's doing it in Turkey, which is a state sponsor of Hamas and a NATO ally, to be sure. And he's attacking the United States, which bankrolls him. So, pointing this out, as Yariv Oppenheimer said, can get you sanctioned today by the United States government, which is operating hand in glove with radical anti-Israel, Israeli-registered NGOs to criminalize Israelis engaging in legal actions. Okay, so that's whether it's ranching or organizing protests of government policies that they abhor or whatever it is. So this is a very dangerous situation. The United States' policy, its day after policy, its today policy, whatever you want, is completely delusional, divorced from reality. And then you look forward and you look around and you see it's in furtherance of a policy that is just going to get more and more people killed. It's going to ensure further bloodshed and war for Israel, for the Jews, and for the people of the region that everybody supposedly cares so much about, including the Palestinians. And it's going to prevent any alternative Palestinian leadership that doesn't oppose the very existence of Israel from ever having a chance of rising up. So these are all the things that we see, starting with Abbas's speech at the Turkish parliament on August 15th, and I think that it's very important. Every once in a while, even though, again, this is ground that has been, plowed over and over again for 30 years, including by myself, and I'm getting tired of it, it's still important every once in a while to go back and remember the Palestinian Authority is also a terrorist organization, and it, like Hamas, is dedicated to the annihilation of the Jewish state. Anyway, those are my thoughts for today. We're going to talk about Chicago, my hometown, later on in this week as it opens itself up to mass demonstrations and rioting by up to apparently 100,000 pro-Hamas demonstrators. Looks to be a hot town in the old town this week. So we'll pay attention to that, and we're going to have a very important interview coming up also this week. So we'll talk to you soon, and have a great day.